Imagine this. You're standing in front of a mirror, but something's wrong. The reflection doesn't move when you do. It watches you, judging perhaps, waiting, and just as you raise your hand to touch the glass, a voice behind you whispers, "That was never you." You spin around, no one's there. The room is still, silent, and yet the whisper remains in your bones, echoing not through your ears, but through every buried memory you thought you'd silenced. A childhood insult that shouldn't matter anymore, but does. A betrayal, a panic attack no one saw, the sting of 100 small abandonments, and worse still, the cold, suffocating realization that none of them ever truly left you. They live inside you, cloaked in the illusion of your identity. Now ask yourself, what if the thing you fear the most is you? You've survived heartbreak, humiliation, powerlessness, maybe even abuse. You made it through. On the surface, you appear whole, functioning, productive, but somewhere, deep beneath the roles you've mastered, lover, worker, parent, friend, lurks a small, quiet fear that you are not safe in your own mind, not from the past, not from others, not even from yourself. How many times have you rehearsed an imaginary argument, replayed a conversation that wounded you, prepared for a pain that hasn't arrived, because it already did long ago and you never forgot how it felt? We say time heals, but does it? Or does it simply bury the wound under layers of performance? And here's the paradox that haunts the soul. We fear being hurt again, yet we hurt ourselves daily to prepare for it. We become the very enemy we swore we'd escape. We repeat cycles, chase approval, build armor from our pain, until the armor becomes a prison, until the mask fuses to the face. So what, then, is freedom? What does it mean to be truly safe? Not in a locked room or a padded mind, but in the presence of your most painful memories, your sharpest fears, your worst mistakes, and still not flinch. Carl Jung once wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." But what if your fate has never been written in the stars, but carved silently in the parts of you you refuse to face? You're told to move on, to forgive, to let go. But how can you forgive what still holds power over you? How can you let go when your entire identity was built in response to pain? What happens if you drop the mask and nothing is underneath but raw, unprocessed chaos? And here is the final, unbearable contradiction. Nothing and nobody will ever hurt you again. Not because harm doesn't exist, but because once you truly see what's happening inside you, the spell breaks. But to see it, you must be willing to descend into the places you avoid, into the inner theater where your shadow plays out every rejection, fear, and insecurity you pretend you've mastered, into the territory Jung called the unconscious, where the ghosts of your past wear your face, and where the only way out is through a truth so shattering it becomes liberating. So ask yourself, what if all your suffering wasn't just bad luck, or bad people, or bad choices, but a message, a distorted form of wisdom, a hidden rite of passage? What if your wounds aren't barriers, but invitations? What if the part of you that still fears being hurt is the very part keeping you from becoming invulnerable? But beware, invulnerability isn't numbness. It isn't cold detachment or a delusion. It's the opposite. It's exposure, radical honesty, inner alignment so deep that no lie can hurt you, not from others, not from within. To arrive there, something in you must die, and something else must awaken. So lean in. This isn't about pop psychology or motivational noise. This is a descent, a peeling back of layers, belief by belief, until all that remains is the self unshackled. Let us now begin the excavation. Let us now ask, what hidden force has ruled your life in silence? And why did it convince you that you'd always be breakable? You were never just afraid of pain. You were afraid of meaningless pain. We can endure the unthinkable when we believe it serves a purpose. We can survive devastation if we understand the lesson hidden inside it. But suffering without meaning, that's what shatters the soul. And this is where the hidden problem begins. You see, most people aren't living their lives. They're surviving their stories. They walk through the world reacting to ghosts. Not actual threats, not real dangers, but the projections of an unconscious mind so wounded, so fragmented that it builds an entire world view out of fear. This is not metaphor. This is psychic architecture. Carl Jung called it the shadow. Everything about yourself you've disowned, rejected, repressed. And it doesn't vanish just because you ignore it. It festers, it waits, it watches. And most dangerously, it acts through you without your knowledge. It chooses who you trust. It decides what you fear. It whispers, "Stay small." And it calls this safety. But let's be precise. What is the shadow, really? It is every part of you that you were told was unlovable. Every desire you silenced. Every fury you buried. Every need that embarrassed you. The shame that made you smile when you wanted to scream. The guilt that made you say yes when you were dying to say no. It is your rage, your jealousy, your hunger to be seen, and also your longing to disappear. As children, we learn quickly what earns love and what earns punishment. And so we adapt. We amputate the unacceptable parts of ourselves to fit the mold. Culturally, religiously, socially, familially. We become half-selves in full costumes. Nietzsche warned of this very act when he said, "He who despises himself still respects himself as one who despises." We become our own tyrants because self-hatred, in a twisted way, still grants us control. If I can hate myself first, we think I will be ready when the world does. So the trauma is not only in what happened to you, it's in what you had to become to survive it. And here's the deeper tragedy. We confuse adaptation with identity. We wear our trauma like armor. But armor becomes heavy. It exhausts, it isolates, and most insidiously, it becomes invisible. You forget you're even wearing it. This is not just personal, it is archetypal. The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer once wrote that life swings like a pendulum backward and forward between pain and boredom. A bleak observation, yes, but one that points to a profound truth. Suffering is not the exception to life. It is the backdrop against which meaning emerges. Without facing this, we become emotionally evasive, spiritually fragmented. We become numb in the pursuit of stability. Society rewards this numbness. It calls it success, composure, maturity. It teaches us that to be strong is to be unbothered, unshakable, indifferent. But that's not strength, it's suppression. And suppression leads not to peace, but to pathology, depression, anxiety, addiction, perfectionism. These aren't the problems, they're symptoms. They are messages from the unconscious, screaming for integration. This was Jung's warning. What you refuse to face will rule you, and you'll call it fate. You'll say, "That's just how I am." You'll say, "This always happens to me." You'll say, "I guess I'm just unlucky in love," or "I guess I'm not meant to be happy." But underneath those phrases lie ancient wounds. Wounds that never healed because they were never seen. And here's the most insidious illusion. We believe that if we could just avoid hurt, we'd finally be safe. But pain avoidance is not freedom, it's bondage. By avoiding pain, we give it power. You stay silent in a room where you should roar. You smile in a relationship where you are shrinking. You obey a system that dehumanizes you, because rebellion feels like danger, because safety, you were taught, comes from compliance. Enter Aldous Huxley, who warned in Brave New World, not of tyranny through suffering, but of tyranny through pleasure. sedation, numbness, distraction, a society where you're too entertained to notice your chains. We are not free, we are anesthetized. We self-medicate with dopamine, achievements, likes, and validations. We chase peace through productivity as if burnout were a badge of honor. But deep in the marrow of our psyche, a question remains unanswered. Who would I be if I stopped performing? And that is the great terror, because if the performances stop, so might the love, so might the belonging, so might the illusion of control. Viktor Frankl, who survived the concentration camps, discovered this brutal truth. When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. And changing yourself does not mean upgrading your habits or tweaking your mindset. It means confronting the core illusions of your identity. It means asking, who am I without my trauma? But let's be honest, part of you doesn't want to know. Because the trauma, for all its suffering, made you who you are. It gave you empathy, depth, vision, but it also shackled you to the past. And the shadow thrives in the dark. As long as it remains hidden, it stays safe. And so, unconsciously, we protect our pain, because letting go of it feels like letting go of the only story we've ever known. But if your story begins with pain, it doesn't have to end there. Not if you're willing to descend. Not if you're willing to excavate. Not if you're willing to name the wound and refuse to let it define you. So now we must ask the next question, the harder one. What has your pain cost you? Not just in emotion, but in identity, in freedom, in possibility. Because only when you see what's been stolen can you begin the rebellion. There's a kind of quiet devastation that lives in people's eyes. Not the kind born from disaster, but the kind that comes from years of pretending. A slow erosion of the soul, so gradual that you hardly notice until one day you look in the mirror and realize you've vanished. Not all at once, piece by piece. That's the unseen consequence of a life built around avoiding pain. You become invisible to yourself. Not because you lack substance, but because the self that remains is curated, filtered, polished to survive in a world that demanded performance instead of presence. It starts innocently enough. You tell yourself you're being realistic, that it's better to lower expectations than be disappointed, that some risks just aren't worth the cost. And so you trade authenticity for acceptance, truth for harmony, depth for functionality. But what you don't realize is that every time you silence a truth, to stay safe, you exile a part of yourself into the unconscious. You begin to live not as a person, but as a compromise. The hidden force that began as survival eventually becomes identity. And that's where the damage multiplies, not in the dramatic moments, but in the slow daily betrayals of the self. The smile you fake, the boundary you don't set, the silence you maintain when everything inside you is begging to speak. We don't just inherit traumas, we inherit the strategies used to survive it. And these strategies, unchecked, become generational, cultural, systemic. You've seen it before. The man who becomes a workaholic because love was always conditional. The woman who becomes a caretaker because her worth was tied to other people's needs. The child who becomes the joker, the golden one, the invisible one. Anything but the burden. These aren't quirks of personality. They're masks forged in the fire of early pain, worn so long they calcify into identity. And society rewards these masks. Your productivity becomes more important than your well-being. Your politeness is praised, even if it's killing your spirit. Your ability to endure silently is mistaken for strength. But the soul knows. The body remembers. Cognitive neuroscience confirms what Jung intuited decades ago. The unconscious isn't just a poetic metaphor, it's a neurological reality. Your brain encodes trauma in your nervous system. The amygdala, the brain's threat detector, doesn't understand time. It doesn't know the difference between then and now. If a past experience was never integrated, it lives in you as if it's still happening. That's why you panic in situations that don't logically warrant panic. Why you freeze when you should speak. Why you overreact, underreact, or dissociate altogether. You're not broken. You're trapped in an invisible loop, what Jung would call complexes. These are emotionally charged clusters of memories, ideas, and fears stored deep in your psyche, activated whenever a current experience rhymes with a past wound. And they run silently in the background, like malware. You think you're choosing your partner, your job, your beliefs, but often you're choosing based on what your pain recognizes, not what your soul desires. The familiar feels safe, even if it's toxic. The unknown feels dangerous, even if it's freedom. This is the consequence of an unexamined unconscious. You confuse safety with control. You confuse avoidance with healing. And here's where the societal trap closes in. We live in a culture obsessed with moving on. Don't dwell, don't overthink. Be strong, stay positive. But what they don't tell you is that moving on without processing is just emotional bypassing. You don't get over the past by pretending it didn't matter. You metabolize the past by confronting its meaning, especially the parts you wish you could erase. This is what Carl Jung meant when he said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Healing doesn't begin with affirmations. It begins with confrontation. And yet, modern culture would have you sedated, not just with substances, but with distractions, scrolling, streaming, self-help that never cuts deep enough to hurt. This is Huxley's nightmare again. Not a world ruled by tyranny, but one numbed by comfort. A society of people who smile while dying inside, who talk about boundaries and alignment, but are too afraid to be radically honest, who spiritualize their avoidance with words like vibes and manifestation, while their shadow quietly drives every decision they make. And what's the cost? You lose intimacy with others, with yourself. You become a stranger in your own life. Not because you don't feel, but because you feel too much and never learned how to hold it. You become allergic to vulnerability. You chase relationships that reenact your oldest wounds because at least the pain is predictable. You build a life that looks stable, but secretly trembles under the weight of unspoken truths. This is the war beneath the surface, not between you and others, but between your conscious self and the buried parts you've tried to forget. And the longer you ignore that inner conflict, the more it leaks out through sabotage, fatigue, disconnection, spiritual emptiness. The more success you chase, the more hollow it feels. The more control you exert, the more chaos you secretly fear. Eventually, the truth becomes unbearable. You've been living as a reaction, not as a choice. But this moment, this recognition, is sacred, because once you see the trap, you're no longer asleep inside it. You begin to ask different questions, not how do I fix myself, but who taught me I was broken? Not how do I avoid pain, but what is my pain trying to reveal? And these questions, they do something profound. They break the spell. So here at the edge of unraveling, the question is no longer, what's wrong with me? It becomes, what would I be without this fear? Who would I be if nothing and nobody could ever hurt me again? Not because harm doesn't exist, but because I no longer fear what it awakens in me. You are not the wound. You are the one witnessing it. And in that witnessing, the rebellion begins. You are not here to be safe. That's the first lie that must die. Safety is the cage, not the comfort it promises, but the confinement it demands. Every time you make safety your God, freedom becomes your enemy, and slowly, without noticing, you worship at the altar of fear and call it being responsible. But let me ask you something brutal. What if the version of you that's safe is also the version of you that's dying? That tight, controlled, rehearsed self, that overly agreeable, overly polished persona, that predictable, non-threatening presence you offer the world to keep from being hurt again. It's not you. It's your armor. And here's the hard truth. The armor didn't just protect you from pain, it protected you from transformation. Carl Jung once wrote, "We meet ourselves time and again in 1,000 disguises on the path of life." What he meant was this: the very thing you are running from is the door to your freedom. Not around it, not beyond it, through it. The rebellion begins here, with the terrifying act of remembering who you were before the world told you who to be. And it will feel like death, because in a sense it is. The ego, the mask you've constructed to navigate this world, will fight you. It will tell you that change is dangerous, that healing is betrayal, that reclaiming your full self is arrogant, selfish, even delusional. It will whisper, stay small, stay good, stay predictable. But you must do something radical, something most people never dare. You must betray the identity that betrayal built. That means questioning every inherited belief that keeps you small. It means telling the truth even when your voice shakes. It means choosing integrity over approval. It means standing in the fire of your own becoming. No guarantees, no applause. Because freedom isn't given. Freedom is taken one honest breath at a time. But how? Where does one even begin to shatter the illusion so deeply woven into their blood? Start by remembering this. You were never meant to be whole without your shadow. The parts of you that rage, that fear, that ache, that hunger, they are not errors. They are messages. They are maps. Jung called this the integration of the shadow, not its eradication. You don't kill the darkness inside you. You make it conscious. You give it language. You give it a seat at the table, not to dominate you, but to inform you. This is not poetic mysticism. This is psychological rebellion. When you stop trying to be good and start being whole, something changes. The anxiety loosens its grip. The depression becomes a compass. The addiction becomes a clue. The people who once intimidated you begin to shrink in your eyes, not because they got smaller, but because you no longer need their approval to breathe. You stop reacting and start responding. You stop performing and start being. And in this space, this fierce, quiet clarity, choice returns. You realize, I do not have to keep reenacting the wounds of my childhood in my relationships. I do not have to keep proving my worth through achievement. I do not have to shrink so others feel comfortable. I do not have to be liked to be real. I do not have to be unhurt to be powerful. Because pain is not the enemy. The real enemy is the story that says pain must be avoided at all costs. Let it burn. Let it break you open. Let it show you what you're made of. Because on the other side of that fire is someone you've never met before. Your unarmored self. This is not self-help. This is war. But not a war against others. A war against delusion. A war against the lie that your value is conditional. Your truth is inconvenient. And your power is dangerous. Want a blueprint? Look to the rebels of consciousness. Nietzsche, who declared that God is dead, not to promote nihilism, but to challenge blind obedience to inherited morality. His rebellion was not chaos. It was clarity, a demand that we stop outsourcing meaning and create it ourselves. Or Viktor Frankl, who endured the horrors of Auschwitz and came out not destroyed, but illuminated. He found meaning not despite suffering, but through it. That was his rebellion, to suffer consciously, to choose dignity in a world gone mad. Look to those who refuse to play dead, the artist who paints from their scars, the activist who turns their rage into revolution, the survivor who dares to speak when silence would be safer, the monk who stares into the abyss and finds God staring back. All of them broke the same rule. Do not disturb the peace. But sometimes the only way to find real peace is to disturb the false one. So disturb it. Speak the words you were taught to swallow. Say no when your body screams it, but your mouth remains frozen. Walk away from the roles that strangle you. Let people misunderstand you if it means being free. Because the truth is, not everyone will survive your becoming, but you will. And those who cannot hold the fire of your truth, they were never holding you, just the mask. This is the rebellion. Not to fight the world, but to face it without flinching. Not to conquer pain, but to walk through it like a cathedral. Not to become someone new, but to remember who the hell you were before fear started editing the script. So ask yourself, what would change if you believed with your whole body that nothing and nobody could ever hurt you again? Not because life becomes soft, but because you become sovereign. You felt glimpses of it, moments when you stood your ground, said the unspeakable, chose the path your past warned you against. And in those moments, even if your hands trembled, didn't you feel alive? That is your birthright. That is what the wound has been pointing to all along. And now, at the threshold of the final revelation, there is only one question left. What truth is so powerful that once you see it, your suffering can never touch you the same way again? Step into that question. The answer is waiting. There comes a moment, rare, shattering, irreversible, when all the pain, all the trauma, all the spiraling years of confusion finally give way to silence. Not numbness, not dissociation. A silence so deep it feels like truth is breathing through you. Imagine this. You're sitting alone, but for the first time, you're not trying to escape the aloneness. You're not reaching for your phone. You're not rehearsing old arguments or fantasizing future victories. You're just here. And then it hits you, not like lightning, but like gravity. No one is coming to hurt you. No one is coming to save you because no one holds that power anymore. Not your mother's voice still echoing in your head. Not the bully who made you believe you were small. Not the lover who left you. Not the system that failed you. Not even God. At least, not the punishing deity you were taught to fear. The war is over, and you are still here. That's the realization that ends all illusions. You were never meant to be invincible. You were meant to be indestructible. There is a difference. Invincibility is the fantasy of the wounded child. It imagines a life where nothing bad ever happens again, where no one can criticize, abandon, betray, or deny you. But indestructibility is the birthright of the integrated soul. It knows the world is chaos, that people will hurt you, that loss is inevitable, and it no longer matters, because nothing can truly be taken from you that is you. You are not your story. You are not your trauma. You are not your wounds, your defense mechanisms, your survival strategies. You are the awareness beneath it all, the untouched field of consciousness that watched it all unfold and is still watching. This is what Jung pointed to when he said, I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become. He didn't mean it as a motivational quote. He meant it as a spiritual awakening. You are not the abandoned child. You are the one who returned to hold that child. You are not the anxious adult. You are the one who sees the anxiety without becoming it. You are not the failures, the regrets, the shame. You are the one who survived them. The ultimate truth is this: you were never broken. You were just buried under layers of conditioning, under inherited pain, under societal scripts that told you to be agreeable, attractive, efficient, obedient, spiritual, but never whole. But now the excavation is done. Now you've touched the core. And what do you find? Not perfection, not bliss, not certainty, but something far more powerful: presence. The raw, vibrating presence of being here now, with nothing left to prove, nothing left to hide, and no one left to become. You don't need permission. You don't need validation. You don't even need healing in the way you once thought. Because what you discover when all the noise dies down is that healing was never about fixing what was wrong with you. It was about remembering that nothing essential about you was ever touched. That's why nothing and nobody will ever hurt you again. Not because harm doesn't happen, but because it no longer defines you. Pain may visit, but it will not live here. Loss may sting, but it will not break you. Criticism may echo, but it will not steer you. Because your selfhood is no longer negotiable. This is what it means to become sovereign. You are no longer a reaction. You are a response. A conscious, embodied, non-apologetic response to life. And in this space, the world changes. Not because it has, but because you have. You see the abuser and feel compassion. Not permission, not reconciliation, but clarity. You see their wound, and more importantly, you see that their wound is not your responsibility. You see your past not as a chain, but as a path. Every twist and scar an initiation into your own becoming. You look in the mirror and don't just recognize yourself. You honor yourself. The self that didn't die despite everything. The self that kept whispering when you tried to silence it. The self that remained sacred even when you were convinced you were profane. And now, what remains? Only this: freedom. Not the freedom sold to you by capitalism. Not the illusion of choice inside a system of conditioning. Not the freedom of do whatever you want. But the deeper freedom. The freedom to be exactly what you are, with nothing added and nothing hidden. The freedom to be soft without fear, to be powerful without guilt, to walk away without shame, to cry in public, to dance alone, to speak truths that burn bridges and not look back. The freedom to no longer perform your worth, to no longer outsource your self-respect, to no longer carry what was never yours to begin with. This is not just psychological, it is ontological, a shift in your being. You are no longer the character in the story. You are the author, and you choose again and again to write in a voice that is undeniably yours. So let me ask you one final time, what would you become if you no longer feared being misunderstood? What would you do if you trusted that the parts of you others rejected were the very keys to your liberation? Who would you be if you believed completely that nothing and nobody will ever hurt you again? Not because the world has changed, but because you have. The answer is not a theory, it's not a list, it's not a practice, it's you, stripped of fear, radiant with truth, whole beyond recognition. And now that you've tasted this knowing, it will never leave you. You may forget, you may stumble, But you will never again be able to pretend you are powerless, because you've seen it. You've seen who you truly are, and once you see that, truly see it, no one can ever take it from you again, not even you.